Sienna God, hello all. Good afternoon, Awado. Thank you for watching. So this is day 10, part A of Reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. And let's continue to learn some stuff. Brazil capitulated to British demands that it end its slave trade after being publicly humiliated by British warships that seized and destroyed slave ships within Brazil's own waters. In 1873, goodness, 2 British cruisers appeared off the coast of Zanzibar and threatened to blockade the island unless the slave market there shut down. It was shut down. You know, jeepers. I mean, gosh. I was just thinking about everything that we're taught in school and stuff, and I was just like, oh my God. Okay. Anyway, people worked hard to get it to stop, right? All right. And the U.S. had a hand in getting those people to stop, as well as the other allies and whatnot. But according to what we've been taught, everybody wanted slavery to continue, especially in the South. I don't know. It would be hard to think of any other crusade pursued so relentlessly for so long. It's fixing to say it. It would be hard to think of any other crusade pursued so relentlessly for so long by any nation at such mounting costs without an economic or other tangible benefit to itself. These costs included bribes paid to Spain and Portugal to get their cooperation with the effort to stop the international slave trade, and the cost of maintaining naval patrols and of resettling freed slaves, not to mention dangerous frictions with France and the United States. Among other countries, captains of British warships who detained vessels suspected of carrying slaves were legally liable if those vessels turned out to have no slaves on board. The human costs were also large. The heavy drain, physical and mental, in keeping squadrons on the East African coast was reflected in the loss of 282 officers and men in the 10 years, 1875 to 85. And this did not include these invalidated home. What? Okay. Period. Naval personnel racked by fever, sunstroke, and dysentery were forced to retire prematurely, and live on a small pittance. Oh dang. The cost of upkeep of the squadron over the 20 years prior to 1890 was estimated at 4 million. Okay, so it says 4 millions sterling, and this did not take into account the large amount of work imposed on consular and judicial staff at Zanzibar in trying cases and dealing with reports, etc. Even so, the results were slow in coming. More streamlined slave ships were designed in hopes of being able to outrun the ships of the Royal Navy in the Atlantic. Nevertheless, the dogged persistence of the British eventually reduced the shipment of slaves across the Atlantic and across the waters of the Islamic world. Although the French flag was for many years widely used as protection from the boarding of ships on the high seas by the British Navy, even by slave traders who were neither French nor authorized to fly the French flag. Eventually, France itself turned against slavery, outlawed the institution, and sent home its own warships to patrol the Atlantic off the coast of Africa to intercept and deter the shipment of slaves to the Western Hemisphere. The American flag was likewise so used in the United States. Like France, eventually turned against the slave trade and sent warships to join the Atlantic patrols to interdict slave shipments. Although by 1860 the Atlantic slave trade had been effectively stopped, the slave trade from East Africa across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf took longer to be reduced significantly. Off the east coast of Africa, smaller Arab vessels called DHOWS, hugged the coastlines in waters too shallow for the British warships to enter. One British commodore estimated that he captured 1 dhow for every 8 that escaped. Nevertheless, during the period from 1866 to 1869, 129 slave vessels were captured and 3,380 slaves were freed. Wow. When the threat of being boarded seemed imminent, the Arabs would throw slaves overboard to drown, oh my God, rather than have them be found on board. which could lead to British seizure of the vessel and punishment of those who manned it. The worst that could befall the slaves was when the slaver was overhauled by a British cruiser and they might be flung overboard to dispose of all evidence. Devereux, Devreaux, mentions a case where the Arabs, when pursued by an English cruiser, cut the throats of 24 slaves and threw them overboard. Oh my God. Colum, Cololm, also states that Arabs would not hesitate to knock slaves on the head and throw them overboard to avoid capture. Whoa. Because there were only a few naval ships available to cover a vast expanse of water in this region, British warships would often launch smaller boats to engage the Arab slave dhows. In these cases, as one study put it, in quotes, the slave traffickers frequently did not hesitate to attack boat crews in defense of their profits, end quote. Battles between the Arabs' vessels and the smaller British craft were especially likely when the larger ships that launched them were too far away to reach the scene in time to join the battle. In other cases, the Arabs fled even from the smaller British vessels, and an episode in 1866 was typical. On 26 April 1866, the Penguin set out after a dhow and fired several shots in an effort to make the crew come to. When the dhow failed to lower its sail, Gartorth, Gartorth, felt certain that she was a slaver and ceased firing for the sake of the slaves on board. However, he managed to close with the dhow, which then made for the rocks through a heavy surf. By the time the ship's boats could be lowered to follow, the Arab crew had fled, but the pounding surf made any attempt by the slavers to salvage the human cargo too dangerous. To their horror, the boat crew found they too could not reach the dhow, which was rapidly filling with water, drowning the slaves. The boat officer decided that he could not risk coming in close to the dhow, but several of the crewmen of the cutter recklessly dived in and swam through the surf to the dhow. In a remarkable display of courage, the sailors managed to bring 28 of the slaves back to the boat, but the dhow appeared to have more than 200 slaves on board, and most died in the pounding waves. Oh my God. In another episode, the Arabs' ruthlessness toward the slaves was further revealed. When the Daphne's cutter captured a dhow with 156 slaves on board, many were found to be in the final stages of starvation and dysentery. One woman was brought out of the dhow with a month-old infant in her arms. The baby's forehead was crushed. Oh my God. And when she was asked how the injury had happened, she explained to the ship's interpreter that as the boat came alongside, the baby began to cry. One of the dhow-men, fearing that the sailors would hear the cries, picked up a stone and crushed the child's head. Oh my God. This was not a unique act. British missionary and explorer David Livingstone, Livingstone, related a similar incident on land, and quote, one woman who was unable to carry both her load and young child had the child taken from her and saw its brains dashed out on a stone, end quote. Whoa. I can't even imagine. Dr. Livingstone also reported having nightmares for weeks after encountering Arab slave traders and their victims. Not only was this Christian missionary shocked by the brutality of the Arab slave traders, so was Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was a battle-hardened military commander. None of this means that the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade should be ignored, downplayed, or excused. Nor have they been. A vast literature has detailed the vile conditions under which slaves from Africa lived and died during their voyages to the Western Hemisphere. But the much less publicized slave trade to the Islamic countries and even higher mortality rates en route, as well as involving large numbers of people over the centuries. Even though the Atlantic slave trade had higher peaks while it lasted, by a variety of accounts, most of the slaves who were marched across the Sahara toward the Mediterranean died on the way. While these were mostly women and girls, the males faced a special danger: castration to produce the eunuchs in demand as harem attendants in the Islamic world. My God. Because castration was forbidden by Islamic law, the operation tended to be performed usually crudely in the hinterlands before the slave caravans reached places within the effective control of the Ottoman Empire. The great majority of those operated on died as a result, but the price of eunuchs was so much higher than the prices of other slaves that the practice was still profitable on net balance. Oh my God. The British Governor General of the Sudan C.G. Gordon estimated that between 1875 and 1879, from 80 to 100,000 slaves were exported through his region. General Gordon imposed the death penalty on those convicted of castrating slave men to market them as eunuchs. His attempt to stamp out slave trading in the Sudan cost him his own life, as an opposing army raised and led by Muhammad Mahad, M-A-H-A-D, defeated his troops at Khartoum, anyway, Khartoum in 1885, and killed Gordon, after which the slave trade flourished again. Oh man, of course it did. British control in the region was firmly reestablished in 1898 by the crushing victory of troops led by Lord Kitchener, Kitchener, at Omdurman, Omdurman, and including a young officer named Winston Churchill. Shut the front door. On the issue of slavery, it was essentially Western civilization against the world. At the time, Western civilization had the power to prevail against all other civilizations. This is how and why slavery was destroyed as an institution in almost the whole world, but it did not happen all at once or even within a few decades. When the British finally stamped out slavery in Tanganyika, Tanganyika, in 1922, it was more than half a century after the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States, and vestiges of slavery still survived in parts of Africa into the 21st century. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites and even blacks who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. Wasn't taught that in school, was you? I surely wasn't taught that in school. It was always white man bad, black people victim, you know what I mean? Okay. An estimated 1/3 of the quote-unquote free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Shut the front door. Oh my God, you guys, I cannot believe that. What the frickin' frack? Hold on a minute. I'm sorry, because I've never heard this before. I have not. We have already passed up the area where I read it, put it down because I was upset, right? And then years later, now I'm reading it to you guys, right? Way past that. We're on page 127. I don't even know if I made it to page 20 on my own before, but hold on a minute. Okay, so it said, an estimated 1/3 of the quote-unquote free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Volunteered. Y'all, I'm gonna get a case of the vapors. I'm just kidding. I think that's gas related or something, you know what I mean? Shut up. Okay. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. I did not know that. And in short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century, and outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. The moral dimensions of slavery. If slavery is not morally wrong, it is hard to imagine what else could possibly be wrong yet. When Lincoln expressed this view, which was gaining currency in his time, it was a belief less than a century old in the West and still virtually non-existent outside the West. If slavery is not morally wrong, it is hard to imagine what else could possibly be wrong. In ancient times, Aristotle had attempted to justify slavery, but many other Western and non-Western philosophers alike took it so much for granted that they felt no need to explain or justify it at all. Some Muslims, Muslims, regarded attempts to abolish slavery as impious, impious, since the Quran, Koran itself accepted slavery as an institution. Shut up. While trying to ameliorate, ameliorate, the lot of the slave. Only in the American South did a large apologetic literature developed. I'm sorry, I'm just like tripping out over what I was reading before. In the background, I like in my mind, I'm just like, the back of my mind, I'm just like, I can't freaking believe this, you know? Okay, let me get back on track. All right, I promise. Here we go. Only in the American South did a large apologetic literature develop seeking to justify slavery, because only there was slavery under such large scale and sustained attacks on moral grounds as to require response. While slavery was referred to in antebellum America as a quote-unquote peculiar institution and an international perspective, and in long view of history, it was not this institution that was peculiar, but the principles of American freedom, with which slavery was in such obvious and irreconcilable, conflict. If all men were created equal, as the Declaration of Independence proclaimed, then the only way to justify slavery was by depicting those enslaved as not fully men. A particularly virulent form of racism thus arose from a particularly desperate need to defend slavery against telling attacks that invoked the fundamental principles of the American Republic. Nowhere else in the world was slavery in such dire straits ideologically, and nowhere else did racism reach such heights, in parentheses, or depths, close parentheses. In defense of the institution, as a noted study of Brazil observed, in quotes, the defenders of slavery on clearly racist grounds were as rare among public supporters of slavery in Brazil as they were common in the United States, end quote. Brazil was not a democracy and so had no such ideological contradictions to overcome. In short, racism was neither necessary nor sufficient for slavery, whose origins antedated racism by centuries. Exactly. Racism was a result, not a cause of slavery. And not all societies that enslaved people of another race became pervaded with racism to the extent that the American South did. They don't go hand in hand. You know what I mean? They got slaves because they're racist. No, that's not how it worked. The stark contrast between the slave and the free, which made slavery a moral issue, which totally turns up on end what has been force-fed down our throats all of these years, all these generations. Like, it's freaking ridiculous. Okay. Stark contrast between the slave and the free, which made slavery a moral issue in the Western world in modern times, was simply not there for most societies and for most of history in most of the world. In hierarchical societies where people were born into their situations in life, ranging through many gradations from royalty to bondage, slavery was simply the bottom rung on a ladder based on the accident of birth, one notch below the serf, S-E-R-F, who was bought and sold with the land instead of individually. Get out of here. Okay. This is not to say that being a slave, I've never heard of that before. I thought they were all, I don't know, I'm grouping everybody, you know what I mean? But like, I had no idea that people were bought and sold with the land. They stayed with the land. But I mean, it kind of makes sense that, right? Because then once you get to know the ins and outs of the land, what goes best where, like what you're doing, like how everything works, you kind of want that flow to stay because they know the land. I don't know. I don't understand. This is not to say that being a slave was a matter of indifference. A horror of becoming a slave has been widespread around the world, but this is wholly different from a reluctance to enslave others. Christians, Muslims, Moslems, and Jews all forbade the enslavement of their own respective fellow religionists, though they did not always honor even this ban. Oh, dang. But all considered it permissible to enslave others. Oh, I bet they did. Clergy themselves, shut the front door. Clergy themselves had slaves, and both Christian monasteries in Europe and Buddhist monasteries in Asia owned slaves. Shut up. Even Sir Thomas More's fictional ideal society utopia had slavery. What? Okay, we're gonna leave it at that. Don't go make you gonna go chance get to a minute. Love you minute.